Good morning. Welcome to Waggy Dog. I haven't made a video in a couple of months because I don't have a sales strategy yet. Not quite sure how to market these videos. And I had said to myself, I'm not going to make a whole bunch more unless I know how to get people to actually watch them. Still haven't figured that out. But something interesting happened a couple nights ago that I wanted to talk about, so I put the camera on this morning. It's late June, by the way, June 22nd. If you have watched any of these videos, you've probably seen a little difference in the foliage. Look at some of the size of some of those leaves, by the way. That's a shagbark hickory. That leaf is humongous. Gotta be 13, 14 inches long. I'm reading a book called The White Princess. The White Princess is a Philippa Gregory novel. Historical fiction. I like historical fiction. Philippa Gregory is English. She writes about English history from predominantly the Tudor period and the War of the Roses. The Tudor period, that's Henry VII, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth. The War of the Roses precedes that. It's more or less a battle between rival factions of the royal family, the royal house. They're battling back and forth for the crown, and the thing gets passed around. It's confusing. The War of the Roses ends at Bosworth Field, where King Richard III and the York forces are defeated by Henry Tudor and the Lancastrian forces. And Henry Tudor steals the crown, puts it on his head, becomes Henry VII, and founds the Tudor line. He's the father of Henry VIII, grandfather of Queen Elizabeth. Those guys are Tudors. Now, I like historical fiction. Although this particular book, The White Princess, it's only so-so. The other Boleyn Girl, The Boleyn Inheritance, those are Philippa Gregory novels too. I thought they're much better. This one kind of drags on a bit. Still, if you're interested in the period, if you're interested in sort of imagining what it would be like to live at another time, it's fun to sink yourself into a novel and just think about, yeah, how would I react if I were living and these were the conditions? So after the battle at Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor wins. He's now King of England. He does something that many victors have done throughout history. He marries someone from the rival faction. In this case, he marries Elizabeth of York, a princess from the York house. She's the title character. She's the White Princess. So the book, The White Princess, is told from her perspective, and it more or less delineates the reign, or the earlier years of the reign of Henry VII, and his, kind of paranoia, his sense that there's always somebody from the rival York house that's pretending to be a friend but is really an enemy. He's just waiting to be overthrown the whole time. There's all sorts of intrigue and violence. Okay, Brewster, let's go. No, come on. Okay, let's go, buddy. Let's go. Now, what I found fascinating about the book, aside from all the history and everything else, is something that was really irrelevant to the story. Philippa Gregory is an expert on this period of time. She's written umpteen novels from the period. She knows as much about it as probably anybody alive. And at one point, Elizabeth of York, she's now Queen Elizabeth, is talking about some people coming to court, and she mentions the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Now that name struck me, Edward de Vere, because Edward de Vere is a very famous guy. Extremely famous guy, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Edward de Vere in 1485. I happen to know that Edward de Vere was the Earl of Oxford in 1585. 100 years later, he was the Earl of Oxford. Why did she put him in 1485? Kind of curious. I went to Wikipedia. I looked up the Earl of Oxford, and sure enough, in 1485, 1490, 1500, the Earl of Oxford was John de Vere. Now, the Earl of Oxford is always a de Vere. That title is held by the de Vere family. They hold it for, I don't know, 400 or 500 years. About 5 of them in a row are named John de Vere. There's some Aubrey de Veres, there's some Richard de Vere. But there's only one Edward de Vere. No, Brewster, we're not going there now. Come this way. Now, Philippa Gregory has to know that Edward de Vere was not the Earl of Oxford in 1485, but why does she place him there? And I guess she did it just for the drama of it, just for the controversy of it, just for the fun of it. She wouldn't make a mistake like that unless she had some reason, so I suspect she did it just because it was kind of fun. By the way, he's a very, very minor character in the novel. You really don't even need him in the novel. But she does it because Edward de Vere is as famous as anyone on the planet Earth. I would say Edward de Vere. Now, if you're a de Vereist, if you're a de Vereist, and I'll get to that in a minute. If you are a de Vereist, and I'm a bit of a de Vereist, if you're a de Vereist, Edward de Vere is probably one of the top 10 most famous people of all time. Who would be the most famous person of all time? Not to be sacrilegious, but presuming that Jesus was a man, and you're going to count him as a famous person, not God on earth, I think Jesus certainly would be a good pick for the most famous person of all time. Maybe Muhammad, Confucius. I don't know, Galileo, Da Vinci, Isaac Newton, maybe Genghis Khan, Caesar, Hitler. Those guys. And Edward de Vere. Edward de Vere. Now, if you don't know who Edward de Vere is, you're thinking, huh? What the hell are you talking about? But he is that famous. You've heard of him. You've heard of him. Because Edward de Vere was a writer, playwright, poet. If you're a de Vereist, you believe that he was the most famous writer of all time, the most famous poet of all time. He simply wrote under a different name. Much like Samuel Clemens chose the name Mark Twain, Edward de Vere wrote under the name of William Shakespeare. If you're a de Vereist, or sometimes called an Oxfordian, you believe that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, actually wrote the plays attributed to a person named William Shakespeare. Now, I'm a bit of a de Vereist, but I don't go all in for the reason that most people don't go in. And that's because there is some existing de Vere poetry. I've read some of de Vere's poetry. I've read some letters that he's left behind. And they're competent. They're well written. But they're really not up to snuff. They're not Shakespearean. They don't have that spark of genius. To be or not to be, that is the question. You don't really find that in Edward de Vere. What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties. No, I never discovered anything like that in de Vere. You hold the two side by side and you say, well, this can't be Shakespeare. And that's a strong argument. You might say, well, those are the works of a child. Those are poems that he wrote when he was a very young man. And that may be the case. The letters, well, he wrote those letters functioning as an earl. They're strictly political documents. He's trying to keep artistry out of it. You might say that. Seems a little weak. Hang on. Seems a little weak, but maybe you could excuse him. So when people say there's just no way Edward de Vere could be William Shakespeare, and they trot out the existing poetry, yeah, okay, I hear them. That's a problem. That's a problem, no doubt about it. The poetry's not as good. It lacks the genius of Shakespeare. But if you put that aside, if you say, okay, there's an explanation for that, I'm not sure what it is, but there's an explanation for that. You put that aside and you start to line up the facts for de Vere being Shakespeare and for the man from Stratford-on-Avon not being Shakespeare, the case becomes almost irresistible. I mean, it's almost irresistible. The more you learn, the more interesting it gets. Now, I became susceptible. You know what I'm going to do? This is going to be a super long video again. We're going to take a pause here. Make a part 2, and that'll begin up near that pine tree.